Hello and welcome. My name is Stephen Rogelberg. I'm president of SIOP, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. I'm joined today by Congressman Derek Kilmer, who is chairman of the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Chairman Kilmer started his career in economic development before being elected to the Washington State Legislature in 2005. He served until 2012, when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2019, he was named chairman for the newly established Select Committee. Chairman Kilmer, thank you for being here.
Thanks a bunch. It's great to be with you.
Well, we have a number of questions for you, and we're just so excited that you're here to share your thoughts. Could you start by telling me a little bit about the committee, its mission, and how it came to be?
You bet. So about every 20 or 30 years or so, Congress realizes things aren't working the way they ought to, and they create a committee to do something about it. This year's iteration, as you pointed out, is called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which makes it sound like we're the IT help desk a little bit. But really, our mission is to make Congress work better and to make it serve the American people better. I'm pretty conscious of the fact that as a member of Congress, I'm part of an organization that, according to recent polling, is less popular than head lice, colonoscopies, and the rock band Nickelback. And, you know, I think, frankly, sometimes when you see what's happening in our nation's capital, you have a pretty good sense of why that's the case. And so this committee was set up really with an eye towards investigating some of the problems with Congress and recommending solutions to make Congress be more efficient and effective and transparent on behalf of the American people.
And so what does success look like for you then?
It's a great question. You know, we identified some goals early on, and some of our task was mandated by the rule that established this committee. You know, we were asked to look at things like staffing. You know, how does Congress recruit and retain and have more diverse staff? We were asked to look at issues related to technology. Congress has been described as an 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. You know, we were asked to look at things like how members of Congress communicate with their constituents. We were asked to look at rules and procedures. And then there's some things that, you know, frankly, you know, I've kind of established as goals, and this definitely intersects with your profession. You know, one of the things that I feel compelled for our committee to look at is how do you change some of the norms and culture of a place that seems really broken right now? You know, looking at how members of Congress treat each other and some of the activity on the House floor, which too often resembles the Jerry Springer show. You know, just looking at how to foster civility and collaboration, which is tricky. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about why it's more tricky in this institution, if you're interested. But, you know, so we're you know, our overall mission is make Congress work better for the American people. And then under that, we have specific goals around making changes that will help the institution recruit and retain and have more diverse staff. We have specific goals around civic engagement and how we can connect citizens to the work of Congress better. We have some specific goals around increasing congressional capacity, so it's better able to solve problems for the American people. Rather, you know, what we've seen is as the institutional capacity of Congress has eroded, you know, nature abhors a vacuum, and what fills that role is either the executive branch or lobbyists, and that doesn't serve the interests of the American people. So these are some of the things that our committee is really oriented to dig in on and hopefully make some strong recommendations to make it work better. And I'm really grateful for your profession. We've leaned on folks like Adam Grant up at Wharton and trying to pull on the expertise of organizational psychologists and folks who have expertise in conflict resolution and others, just to try to think through some of the ways to make this institution more effective.
Oh, that's fabulous. All right, that's a perfect segue to my next question. So as you know, industrial and organizational psychology is a discipline dedicated to understanding and positively impacting the world of work through science and evidence. So what role has science and research played in the work of the committee?
A lot, and I will tell you, so, at the individual level, we've worked to just try to understand better the House's challenges with recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce, for example, so that we can, as I just said, try to retain the best and brightest here. The average tenure in Congress is under 3 years for a congressional staffer. And so that level of turnover is not healthy for developing expertise. So we've tried to better understand some of the drivers behind why staff burnout, leave the hill so quickly. We've looked at what the private and nonprofit sectors are doing to just better enable their employees to be happy and fulfilled. That actually led to some recommendations that the committee has already passed to do things like making permanent the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and trying to create a task force on the House workforce to track employer retention and to better assess employee benefits and to actually make some changes to foster that kind of retention at the individual level. And then at the organizational level, we're looking at what we can do to make the House just a more productive institution, a more civil and collaborative institution. And we've leaned on some of the expertise from your profession, quite candidly. I will tell you, maybe I can articulate the problem statement a bit.
Sure.
So there's a few problems. One, Congress is dissimilar to most organizations in which I've worked in that there's not really a unified strategic plan with everybody working toward a similar goal. I live in Gig Harbor, Washington. It's known as the Maritime City. So I like using maritime analogies. The seas are already really rocky. Our country is dealing with a lot of challenging issues. And it's really hard to get the boat where we need it to go if everyone's rowing in the same direction. But in Congress, we have one set of rowers that are going one way. We have another set of rowers that want to go another way. And it's actually even worse than that because we have a decent sized subset of people in the boat who've taken their oars out of the water and are actively trying to beat the other people in the boat over the heads. So that's one problem. Second, the incentives in Congress are really out of whack. There's limited incentives to build consensus. So when building consensus is often required to get anything done, our politics largely don't award those efforts. Most of the folks I know back home say, man, I just wish you folks could work together and solve some problems. And unfortunately, though, you've got some members who are reticent to make those efforts for fear of getting a primary challenge. Plus, we're increasingly in an environment where the incentives are to build Twitter followers more than to build consensus and get things done, or to say divisive things that can get you on Fox News or MSNBC. That is a further challenge. And on top of that, and this is where we've really tried to pull on some of the expertise of your profession, there's limited incentives to play well in the sandbox, which kind of creates a vicious cycle. So let me give you a quick example. When I served in the state legislature back in Washington State, and every bill when I was in the state legislature was brought up under what was called an open rule. In other words, when a bill was brought forward, if you had an amendment that was at all related to the subject of the bill, you could offer it, it would be debated, and it would be voted on. And in 8 years in the Washington State legislature, I can only count maybe 5 or 6 times when that was abused, when someone offered a gotcha amendment solely to be used in a political attack ad. And I contrast that with Congress, where when we've had open rules, it's a series of political amendments entirely designed to jam the other party. And it seems to me that's not really a rules issue, that's a norms issue. In Washington, the norm was don't be a jerk. But for some reason in Washington, D.C., sometimes being a jerk seems to be rewarded. And so as a consequence, here's where it becomes a vicious cycle. The majority party, by and large, keeps the minority party from even offering any amendments, which makes the situation even worse. My observation is that elected officials who are sidelined in their ability to engage are kind of like my family's new puppy. When we don't keep it busy, they chew the furniture. And there's a ton of furniture chewing happening in Congress right now. And then I guess the other thing that I will say is everything's far worse post January 6th insurrection, where you've got a lot of the folks I work with feel like crime victims. I had a Democratic colleague say to me, I feel like I'm in a relationship it's not just that my partner cheated on me, it's like I'm in a relationship and my partner cheated on me with somebody who tried to kill me. And the environment, which was already kind of the pits, has grown far more toxic post January 6th. And so part of, in chairing this committee, part of my challenge has been looking at, okay, so what do you do with that? And so we've reached out to management consultants, we've reached out to political scientists, we've reached out to folks with expertise in family therapy and marriage counseling. I've talked to sports coaches who took over dysfunctional teams, and I've talked to organizational psychologists looking at, one, when you have workplaces that are filled with conflict, what do you do about it? How can research sort of inform potential solutions that we could apply to Congress? I know that was a really long answer, but
No,
I wanted
that
to like, I think it's worthwhile to just get a sense of like, this is really tricky.
We didn't figure it was simple. That
Yeah.
was a great answer. Really appreciate that. As I want to build on that a little bit. So you've got this conflict-filled environment. You're leading this select committee. So how does this play into your role as leader? How do you manage this? What is your strategies for trying to bring folks together?
We've done a lot of different things on this committee that I actually think would be a pretty good model for the rest of Congress. So let me give you some examples. When we've now done 3 hearings looking at how do you build civility and collaboration in a dysfunctional workplace? To summarize in a sentence what we've been looking at. And if you watch those hearings on C-SPAN, one, you have too much time on your hands. But if you watch those hearings on C-SPAN, you'll recognize a few things. One, unlike every other committee in Congress, we're not sitting up on a dais. We're sitting around a round table, and we're not elevated above the witnesses we're talking to. We're looking at them in the eye. Second, that's purposeful, right? I've never had a good conversation speaking to the back of somebody's head. And when members are seated up on a dais, you're basically talking to the back of people's heads. Second, in every committee in Congress, except for ours, you have Democrats sit on one side of the dais and Republicans sit on the other. We don't do that. We don't do that in part because when you're listening to a witness who's sharing ideas with you, your genetic predisposition is to lean over to the person next to you when you hear something interesting and say, hey, that's really interesting. What do you think of that? And in our committee, when you do that, you lean over to someone from the other party, which I think has actually been very constructive in terms of just both fostering trust and trying to create a more collaborative environment. We've done some other things as well. Most committees in Congress, the way it works is everybody gets 5 minutes in a hearing, and it goes by seniority. And, if you're a junior member, you kind of play the role of potted plant until it's your turn. And sometimes you don't even show up until it's your turn. And then you use your 5 minutes to speechify something that you can stick on social media. And then you peace out and leave the committee hearing. And that's not what congressional committees ought to be for, right? Congressional committees ought to be for actually learning something and trying to inform potential decisions that can, in the case of our committee, make Congress work better. So we don't do the whole 5-minute spiel. What we do is we say, if we have a witness that says something interesting and you want to pull on that thread, just wave your hand and we'll call on in. You can ask that question. You're not going to be on the clock. This is not about getting a snippet for social media so that you can, be a viral phenomenon. This is about trying to learn how to make Congress work better. And so if you watch the hearing that we had with Adam Grant and with a family therapist from Minnesota and with Amanda Ripley, who's written this terrific book called High Conflict, and with a political scientist, who's looked at these issues, you'll find that what we had was a discussion, and a discussion that actually led to some interesting ideas. There's some other things that we've done on our committee that are less obvious if you watch a hearing on C-SPAN. So when I was tasked with chairing this committee. The first thing that happens when you get a new committee is that you get the committee's budget. And what generally happens is you do very simple math, and Democrats get their part of the money and Republicans get their part of the money. And by and large, the Democrats use their money to hire people with a Democratic background who put on their blue jerseys, and Republicans hire people with a Republican background who put on red jerseys. And then you spend the rest of the time duking it out. I approached my Republican counterpart at the beginning of this exercise and said, so crazy idea, what if we don't do that? What if we hire a joint staff, and some of them will be people with a Democratic background and some will be people with a Republican background, but they'll all put on fixed Congress jerseys and we'll work together. And I think it's been incredibly constructive. That will not work on every committee, but I think that type of approach has proved to be really helpful. And I'll just mention one other thing. One of the things we've recommended that committees do is start the Congress with a planning retreat, a bipartisan planning retreat. I have never been part of an organization that didn't at the beginning of an exercise say, hey, so what do we want to get done? And until I got to Congress. That really doesn't happen here. And so one of the things, and this was actually recommended to us by an organizational psychologist, was like, and it makes so much sense, is, hey, just do some basic planning on the front end. And we informed that with some science. We started actually the exercise by asking members to talk about why they came to Congress and how it has met or failed to meet their expectation. And that initial conversation informed some of the work that we added to our work plan, because people said, gosh, I didn't realize it was going to be so broken in this way or in that way. We also this year actually brought in an expert on conflict resolution so that we could talk about the stuff around January 6th, so that it isn't that, one of the things that I was concerned about coming into this year was the fact that, the events of January 6th were really traumatic for the institution and for the members of the institution. And I think in the absence of actually talking through that, it has the potential to be that worst argument you ever had with your partner that, 5 years later you argue about when you can't decide what to have for dinner. And I think we're the one committee in Congress that actually sat down, Democrats and Republicans, and just talked through it. And as a consequence, we've been able to at least move forward as a committee. So those are some of the things that you asked what I've tried to do as a leader of this committee to inform, building trust and trying to make our committee a bit more constructive. We've done things like, and we're going to do it again next week, we've had bipartisan dinners where we sit down with some people who have expertise and we break bread together. This came up in our hearing where we had organizational psychologists and others give some advice, and they spoke to the value of breaking bread together and talking through stuff together in a more, when the cameras aren't on. And so those are some of the things that we've tried to do that I think have really built some trust and maybe a bit more spirit of cooperation on our committee.
I love it. I mean, those are great things, and they're very well aligned with team and meeting science. So I really commend you. So have these good examples been adopted by other committees, or is this committee really kind of operating in a vacuum and people aren't seeing this as a great example for others to follow?
We're working on it. We're actually working on sharing some best practices with other committees. We've already made some recommendations, and listen, the best way to drive change in Congress is to show that you're being really productive by doing something different. Our committee in the last Congress, in the 116th Congress, passed 97 unanimous recommendations. So why is that important? Well, if you look at the modern history of these select committees, most of them haven't passed any, like literally zero. There was the super committee to look at debt and deficit reduction. It passed 0 recommendations. There was a committee focused on budget and appropriations process reform. It passed 0 recommendations. And our committee's passed so far 97 unanimous recommendations in the last Congress, and then another 20 in this Congress. And I think that does lead other leaders to say, hey, what are they doing? Because that's pretty interesting. We've already seen action toward implementation on about 60% of the recommendations that we've made. So we're not just making recommendations and having them go into the ether. Our goal is not to make recommendations, it's to make change, it's to make organizational change. That is hard in an institution like this. The House is basically made up of 435 independent contractors. And so making recommendations that either committees or that offices would deem a net positive can be challenging because members have different ideas about what's helpful. And so that's part of the reason. One, we're just simply trying to model good behavior. And even in the, let me give another example. I just said that we have 435 independent contractors in the House. Having said that, our committee just sent every one of those 435 independent offices a report on, okay, so we've looked at those offices that have had the most success on retaining talent. And here's what we found. Here are what some of those offices do. We can share those best practices, and it's still up to the head of the office, the member of Congress, to decide, hey, I want to do that, or, that's not for me. But we're trying to foster some of those best practices and evangelize some of those best practices. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
One of the other things that was recommended by some of the folks in your profession was to look at space, to actually look at, right now, one of the problems we have as an institution is there's no place outside of the C-SPAN cameras that Democrats and Republicans can just talk to each other. Mm. And so one of the recommendations our committee has made is find some space, actually literally find some space for conversation and collaboration.
So you've mentioned quite a few times how you're leveraging science. So what IO psychology related research, evidence, and findings do you wish you had to help you in your efforts? Because maybe we have them, or maybe we can try to get them for you.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the question. I think, and I will say this. So let me give you just a couple more examples of ways that you've already informed this process, right? So, some of the things that we've looked at is, some of the recommendations from your profession have been pretty simple, but pretty important too. So when Adam Grant talked to our committee, one of the things he pointed to was the importance of how new members of an organization get oriented to the organization. Which again, when he said it, I was like, that makes way too much sense. But, if you orient people with an eye towards teaching civility, teaching collaboration, teaching basic norm, not necessarily teaching, but like sharing the norms and expectations, you're a lot better off. Let me contrast that with how Congress has historically oriented people. When I showed up at congressional orientation, literally it was Democrats get on that bus and Republicans get on that bus. And most of orientation was focused on keeping the two parties away from each other. Right. So one of the recommendations we have already made in response to that is stop doing that. Right. So that's one thing. Two, we looked at, and we haven't yet made a recommendation in this space, but looking at whether we could, in the hearing, Adam talked about, one of the sports teams he works with, and that they established what he called the Players Council. Rules are basically what govern us when we're at our worst, to keep us out of trouble. Norms are how we keep each other at our best. Culture is how we keep each other at our best. And that's not necessarily a go get sent to the ethics committee because you violated a rule. It's maybe having one of your colleagues, one of your respected colleagues, kind of pull you aside and say, hey, we really don't do it that way here. Or, we got to try to do better than that. And we don't have that in Congress, but maybe we should. And so I would say one of the things that I think is uniquely challenging about this institution is that it's not really one organization. and that makes this trickier than anything. And I would value, certainly, if those listeners and those with your professional expertise have thoughts on this. We are really challenged by the fact that this is, and I kind of ran through some of those challenges. The one, it's 435 independent contractors. Two, the incentives are out of whack, right? Playing well in the sandbox is not what gets you Twitter followers or gets you on cable news. And I don't think there's something I can do to change that, or that our committee can do to change that. But I think that having recommendations and looking at levers we could pull to foster more collaboration, despite those incentives, would be very helpful for our committee.
That's great. So many of our members really have expertise that ties into so many of the areas that you've brought up today. Are there ways that SIOP and IO psychologists can serve as a resource to the work of your committee and to you?
For sure. One, I would just encourage folks to stay up to date on the work of the committee. We have actually a really good website, I think, called modernizecongress.house.gov. And it actually provides an avenue for sharing feedback with our committee, to sharing ideas with our committee. It also, you can follow us on social media and kind of see what the committee's working on. And, this is too hairy a problem for us not to try to crowdsource solutions. So I hope that anybody who's watching who has thoughts, not just limited to some of these challenges related to the culture of the institution, but some of the other issues that I mentioned too, issues around staffing, I think are really front and center. We're about to have some hearings related to evidence-based policymaking, which, one of the challenges in this place is Democrats and Republicans can't always even agree on what are the basic facts around the issue that we're looking at, right? So I would just invite folks to keep up to date on what we're working on. If you have ideas that you think are important to you or that could be valuable to our committee, please let us know.
No, that's great. Thank you. So I'm pretty much out of questions. So before I close, any final remarks or comments that you would like to make to the IO psychologists around the world, or comments around SIOP and its value, or what have you? Any final remarks you'd like to make?
Well, one, I just want to say thanks. SIOP has been a great resource to our committee already, and so I'm grateful for what you do. I shared with you before we hopped on. Both of my brothers are psychologists. My brother Ryan is at UNC Charlotte, and my brother Jason works at the University of Washington. So they both went into psychology, and I went into politics, which I guess you guys can do the math. But I do think having the expertise that you have and giving us the ability to call upon that expertise has been really, really valuable. So I very much appreciate the work you do. I think it's really important as we try to build a more effective institution. I would also just say for folks watching, keep the faith. I know it can be hard to watch Congress in action. That's both in action and inaction. But I'm a big believer that we can make things work better. And that takes all of us being engaged. When I first got this task, someone sent me a speech by the former Health and Human Services Secretary, John Gardner. And he talked about the importance of being what he referred to as a loving critic. He said, it would be bad to be an uncritical lover, because you deny an institution the sort of life-giving criticism that's needed to improve. It's also, he said, bad to be an unloving critic, which right now the easy thing to do in an institution that's this unpopular is to treat it as the piñata at the party, which happens a lot right now within the Congress and outside of the Congress. And what Secretary Gardner said way back then was, the value of a loving critic is that you care enough about the institution to try to improve it, and you focus on ways to improve it by looking at it with a critical eye. I think that's something that your profession lends such value to. And so I would invite, again, if there's any love and criticism that you can provide, we need it.
Well, thank you. Congressman Kilmer, this was just wonderful. I know I learned a great deal. I'm really inspired by the messages that you shared and your passion and efforts to try to bring this together and to, maximize the potential impact of this institution. Thank you for this gift of time that you gave us. I just really, really appreciate it. And I hope our paths cross in the future and we can meet in person. But until then, thank you very much for joining me and our members.
Thank you.